Remember, kids, hydrate before you dihydrate. Howdy, y'all. I'm Andy King, and welcome to another episode of King's Comics. Now, I started this series back in 2018, which at this point is last year, but we're wrapping it up today. That's right, my 2018 collection video series broken into 6 parts because it took that long to film this whole thing. That being said, let's get right to it. This is the final episode of that series, going through the rest of my comic collection. Let's go. Yeah, okay, at a certain point, just go to the library. Quit buying comics. This just gets exhausting, I'm going to be honest. Okay, so first up we have Sam Zabel and the Magic Pen by Dylan Horrocks. So this series was interesting. It's about this writer artist who I'm assuming is based on the actual real life writer artist who just kind of has a writer's block, right? So then he finds this item called the Magic Pen, which allows him to enter into comic worlds or to bring to life anything he draws. So it's pretty interesting about this idea of the worlds we create, the reasons and our motivations behind them, as well as the ideas that we're putting out into the world or encouraging through the art we make. Next up is Silver Surfer Parable. Actually, this one's getting a re-release this year. It's actually as the name implies, it's a parable. So it's about Galactus coming to Earth, and he's in essence worshipped as a god by humanity. However, the Silver Surfer comes to stop him. It's by Stan Lee and French artist Moebius, with Moebius having, everyone for the most part knows who Stan Lee is, but Moebius is a French artist who's worked on works such as The Inkle, this famous just kind of space opera about a space detective going across the planet going across the universe in order to save all of existence. Now, that movie actually allegedly was the basis for The Fifth Element, if not outright copying multiple elements from the comic into the movie. That's because Moebius worked on the concept art for the movie as well as having worked on that comic. Either way, he's the one who did the art for this, and it's actually it's right off the bat my favorite Silver Surfer story, as well as the only, as far as I know, actual Stan Lee comic that I have. It's funny because it was actually published by Epic Comics, which currently, if I recall, is a imprint of Marvel Comics. But yes, this is the original edition. I got it for like $5 on Amazon. I think just accidentally, so I was very lucky there. Next up we have Station 16. So this one's a bit of a horror sci-fi comic about these researchers who go to a site in the Arctic to explore what happened. The researchers who were there, the community that was there just disappears, and there's a lot of just oddness and weirdness going on. It's a very creepy comic. It's not a lot of jump scares too much. It's just a very eerie environment about what is going on with this place, and it just kind of lingers and gets under your skin after a bit. It's a little bit abstract at times, but I still enjoyed it. Then we have, oh wait, these are out of order. Come on. Okay, gosh. Friendly reminder, sometimes you just gotta stop buying these dang things. Okay, so we got all of Why the Last Man. So it's collected into 5 deluxe volumes. As I was referencing in my earlier Comic Collecting 101 video, there are, you have trades and you have your collections. So this is a series of collections. So they'll collect multiple arcs and trades, and I think in total there's about maybe, oh my gosh, why are there so many of these things? Yep. In total, I think there's about, oh gosh, I don't even know how many issues. Long story short, there's about, I think 12 to 20 issues in each one of these. It's just a lot of comics, and it's easier to collect these hardcovers rather than just collecting the trades by themselves or single issues. Plus, I read this after it had come out and finished its entirety, which is also great for gathering comics, is once the run is done. So this series of comics, Why the Last Man, is by Brian K. Vaughan. It's about this world where all of mankind is eliminated. And that's a misstatement. I don't mean mankind, I mean just males are eliminated except for one man, York Brown, who goes on this journey across America and then the world to try and find his girlfriend, as well as to make sure that his sister and his mother are safe. It's a very interesting, politically driven comic about just the idea of gender roles and social norms in society today, as well as how there are certain roles that men and women are needed to fill with respect to just coexisting on the planet. It's got a lot of great social commentaries on it, as well as a fantastic ending that does tug at the heartstrings, as well as just make the whole story worth it. Alright, then we go into Solo. DC typically loves the number 52. So that's because DC, when they first started, and even presently for the most part, will release a comic, at least one comic, or would release comics weekly, because there are 52 weeks in the year. That's why DC is associated as having 52 worlds in their works, as well as the comic series 52 had a new comic released weekly for the year that it was released in. So then with Solo, DC has the same idea where they released 52 different comics, but each by a different creative team. So different artists and writers were teaming up to create 52 stories. Not just about superheroes like Batman or Superman, though some of them did pertain to those heroes, but there is a story about a black jazz musician being escorted out of the city by a Nazi officer who happens to like his music and doesn't agree with the party's ideas. There's a story about the Teen Titans meeting and having a party. There's just a lot of weird stories, and they dynamically shift from the nature of the story, whether it's surrealistic, whether it's supernatural, whether it's just absurdist comedy. I really just like how all-encompassing these stories were in their narratives, their art styles, and just the plot lines that they kind of directed and the different takes on heroes they had. Or not just heroes, but different elements and genres of the graphic novel medium. Next up, we have Roughneck by Jeff Lemire. So for people who have tuned into this channel, it's kind of a common theme that I'll mention my favorite, or have multiple works by my favorite artists or writers, etc., which is, I mean, honestly what collectors typically do. So I guess that's not really that special, and I'm not really that either way. So Roughneck is by Jeff Lemire, and Jeff Lemire is not only a writer, but he's a writer-artist. So he likes to do a lot of works where he'll write and draw them. He's one of my favorite writer-artists, not just a writer, but I mean, I just enjoy the works that he personally creates because he adds a little bit of a personal touch or personal flair, some deep cutting elements to the story that make them a lot more tangible and emotional. So with Roughneck, you have the story of this washed-up hockey player whose life has kind of gone down the drain just because of his inability to maintain relationships as well as to just connect to people. And it goes from there into his relationships with his family, the idea of everything, his day-to-day circumstances, and this kind of, I wouldn't say redemption story, but coping story about him having to accept the things he's done as well as the reality of the world that he needs to face his demons as well as just try to improve himself for the good of those that he loves. Oh my gosh, I'm actually approaching the end of this. So then, next we have The Wake. This is by Sean Murphy and Scott Snyder, or rather Scott Snyder and Sean Murphy, writer and artist. Scott Snyder, as I've mentioned, is the author or the writer for DC Metal as well as the New 52 Batman run, with Sean Murphy being the writer and artist of a series I mentioned earlier, which is Batman White Knight. One of my favorite Batman stories. I just really, really enjoyed it. So with The Wake, we see this horror comic about mermaids. Yeah, and I'm not kidding. So on this underwater sea base, we see these mermaid-like creatures just coming and attacking all of the research crew. You don't know why, to the point that then they end up flooding the Earth. Now but the story is actually split into two parts. The first part is a lot more horrifying. I mean, it's just bloody and brutal. Then we go to the second part. After the world is flooded, you're in this kind of post-apocalyptic world where you're trying to find out more of the mystery of what these mermaids are, why they attacked people, etc. And it becomes more of a adventure sci-fi. There are still some horror elements there, but it becomes a lot more, I guess, fantastical with respect to the world building and everything going on surrounding these mermaids. Great horror, interesting sci-fi. I enjoyed it. I wish it had kind of resolved a little bit stronger, but at the same time, I just enjoyed the whole ride. I like Scott Snyder as a writer, and I like Sean Murphy as an artist. Next up is Old City Blues. Now, I don't know too much about the author, Giannis Milano Giannis. I probably butchered that. But it turns out he's another writer, illustrator who does his own works. Now, Old City Blues, there's 2 volumes. I've only read the first one because the second one has been oddly hard to find. But in Old City Blues, we see this cyberpunkish dystopian world that's based on animes like Ghost in the Shell, as well as just techno-noirs like Blade Runner. So we see a lot of sci-fi elements like robots, artificial intelligence, our consciousness not being tied just to being human, but being able to be transplanted into robots. It's very interesting, but pays a lot of homage to those sci-fi works I mentioned. Mainly Blade Runner and Ghost in the Shell were a lot of the references I picked up on. Then we have A Taste of Chlorine. So Bastien Vives is, I believe he's a French artist as well as writer, and I know him predominantly from the Last Man series that I'd talked about earlier, which was this interesting, just manga-influenced French graphic novel. But, sorry, I'm getting distracted. So A Taste of Chlorine by Bastien Vives is this interesting pseudo-romantical tale about this boy who meets a girl at a pool, and they just start to interact, but almost just kind of in glancing blows. Like, they don't necessarily just interact head on. They do discuss sometimes, but it's kind of about this kind of fleeting romance story, almost like the crushes we develop when we're kids, and like just how unfulfilled they end up being, or the things left unsaid with respect to these romances and them being building blocks into the people we become. It's very weird. It was very abstract. I'm not going to act like I'm smart enough to break down the kind of poetic narrative going into this, but yeah, it was really good. The ending, though, leaves you to think and meditate about a lot with regards to their relationship as a whole, as well as what their relationship actually was in the end. Next up is Thor Book 2, or Thor God of Thunder Book 2 by Jason Aaron and Esad Ribic. Or rather, Esad Ribic was the primary artist because I've mentioned that I have Book 1, which is probably my favorite Thor comic. It's the combination of the 2 arcs, the God Butcher and the God Bomb arc. That's Book 1, but this is Book 2. I don't feel Book 2 was as strong as Book 1, but I still did enjoy it as it leads into Jason Aaron's second part of his Thor run, which is when Jane Foster becomes Thor. There are 2 books in the series, this one and the next one, but I think if you're going by trades, there's about 4 trade volumes, with the first 2 trades being encompassed in the first book, and then the second 2 trades being encompassed in this collection. Next we have Two Brothers. So, for those who are tracking the Umbrella Academy coming to Netflix, Two Brothers is in part by part of the same creative team. The writer for Umbrella Academy was Gerard Way of is Gerard Way of My Chemical Romance. And the creative team, the artists were Fabio Moon and Gabriel Ba, who are 2 South American twins who have the same art style and will typically collaborate on works because they just can interchange when they're doing art styles. They've worked on things such as Umbrella Academy, Casanova, and Two Brothers. Two Brothers is their own work, though. They wrote and drew it. It's the tale of these 2 brothers in South America, these twins, similar to Fabio Moon and Gabriel Ba, who just are the complete antithesis of one another. They do not get along. They have completely different lifestyles. One's hardworking, one's a slacker, and they each have these different expectations placed on them, realizing that each parent picks a favorite, and because of that, it causes a lot of dysfunction in their family as they grow up, and they try to have identities of their own. So it's a very just kind of shocking and jarring narrative, especially having a brother of my own, but also because in interviews with Fabio Moon and Gabriel Ba, these 2 brothers, it's evident that they love each other, especially because of how often they work together with one another and collaborate. So this was a very, I think, personally driven narrative about what a relationship like that can turn into if it's not healthy. We're almost there, children. Or rather, not children, but boys and girls. Let's keep it going. Next we have Shortcomings by Adrien Tomine. So, Adrien Tomine is an Asian-American author who wrote a work I mentioned previously called Killing and Dying. It's one of my favorite graphic novels, Killing and Dying, is because it's a kind of anthology work just with a lot of very kind of disturbing, dramatic slice-of-life stories about things just going wrong in people's lives. So he continues that trend in Shortcomings with the tale of a couple who are on their way out, so to speak. There's just too much dysfunction and chaos in their relationship, typically revolving around their expectations for one another. Now, this speaks a lot about just the necessity of communication in relationships, as well as the kind of false faces we put on and the expectations we place and burdens we place on one another in the relationships we maintain. I'm not going to go into that or tear that apart too much. It's a book I would recommend for mature readers, for those especially looking for more indie-driven narratives. It is a drama and a romance at the same time. There are some just very tragic scenes in it. I mean, not like violent or anything, but just tragic in terms of it's not a romance. And if it is a romance, it's a romance gone wrong. But it's an interesting story. I just enjoyed the take on it, as well as this idea of what the reality of romances and just not sugarcoating romances in general. Next up is Avengers Rage of Ultron. Unfortunately, this is a comic I was not necessarily in love with. And I say I was not in love with it because of the fact that it's one of my two of my favorite creators, which are Rick Remender as a writer, as well as Jeremy, let me make sure I've got this right, Jeremy Opena? Yep, Jeremy Opena. But, I mean, and they've worked together in the past, but unfortunately this one just didn't do it for me. So this is an OGN, original graphic novel, that is completed in its entirety, where the Avengers are trying to take on Ultron. Except it feels kind of messy and rushed. You've got Sabretooth, who's turned good after the events of another Marvel event written by Rick Remender called Axis. And then you've got Sam Cap, which is when the Falcon, Sam Wilson, becomes Captain America. Either way, it felt messy, rushed, and it all leads to the Avengers facing down Ultron, but specifically Hank Pym facing down Ultron, and him and Ultron having to have just this kind of heart-to-heart, well, as much of a heart-to-heart as you can have with a villain, I suppose, and then eventually merging into one being. Once again, very weird storyline, wasn't in love with it, but I do like the art and I do like the writer, so I'm still kind of debating whether or not I'm going to donate this or whether I'm going to sell it, but for now, it's in the collection. We'll see where I'm feeling by the end of 2019. Next up is the Goon, Chinatown. I kind of need to reread this one. I liked it because the Goon is this character who just goes in this this kind of mysterious town. I forget the name of it. I mean, not Chinatown. Chinatown is one of the kind of suburbs of where he is, or the burbs of where he is. Kind of like a borough. Either way, the Goon used to work as an enforcer for this mob boss. Then the mob boss died, and I believe he pretty much just started working for him in name only, basically saying that he's still an enforcer for this guy who's clearly died, but just maintaining the peace by going around to different territories, collecting money, etc. So in Chinatown, we look more into this character's past, about some of these just supernatural elements going on in his life. It's a very weird story, but I like it because it's this character almost similar to Hellboy in the idea that they're not necessarily superpowered, they're just very tough. Well, Hellboy in and of himself is a demon, but at the same time, he's not shooting laser beams or anything like that. So that's why I like stories like The Goon. They kind of give a realistic sense of power to the person, as in, oh, this is just a very strong human, not necessarily Superman or Iron Man or anything like that. Then we have The Punisher, Welcome Back Frank. Actually, because The Punisher series is about to come out, or Season 2 is about to come out, before Netflix and Disney cancel it, this is a comic I'd recommend for people trying to get into The Punisher. Now, I'm going to do a where to start on The Punisher here soon, but this comic is The Punisher, Welcome Back Frank. It's by Garth Ennis, who I mentioned is the author of the Punisher Max series, which is a large basis for just multiple Punisher movies and shows that have come out, mainly the Punisher events that happen in the Daredevil series, as well as in his solo series. In fact, one of the scenes from Daredevil Season 2, where the Punisher is on the roof about to kill the mob boss, and Daredevil has the gun taped to his hand, is right out of this comic. And they did it very well. The events were portrayed differently, but all that to say, this is an interesting slice of the Punisher's life, and him living in New York, just also interacting with heroes, and not being in a world all by himself in Punisher Max, where there are no superheroes, but still, once again, interacting with heroes like Daredevil, and still just exercising vigilante justice in New York. And yes, there's a lot of violence and death. Next up, since I like superhero deconstruction so much, here we have Zenith, volumes 1 through 4, which is the entire run of the series. I found these for like $10 each at a comic shop in my area in Austin, and I just decided, let's go. Mainly because the writer for this is Grant Morrison, who's pretty famous in the comic world for writing works such as All-Star Superman. And he's had a Batman run, the Batman run where Dick Grayson, Nightwing, was Batman, and Bruce Wayne's son Damian Wayne was Robin. Now, in Zenith, we have this interesting deconstructive story about this world where superheroes were created by government experimentation. Then I think in the 60s and 70s, they all became hippies. Now, these are beings with telekinetic abilities. They can, shoot fire out, they can fly, they have super strength, etc. However, they have kids. Generations later, we come to Zenith, who in this world is a superpowered pop star. So, he's got singles out, he's very big in Britain, etc., but he's also very selfish and arrogant and concerned with saving his own skin or producing another hit single or chart topper, not necessarily being a superhero. But that changes drastically as the series goes on, but also is interesting because as a person, he doesn't necessarily change. He becomes slightly more heroic, but it still has elements of just self-preservation. Either way, the series gets very weird, even starts dipping into very strange, almost supernatural elements, a little bit of a Lovecraftian, weird, interdimensional creatures. Very, very weird, but a good superhero work for those who do not mind a bit of a non-conventional superhero storytelling. Oh, hey. I mentioned this earlier, but hey, found it. So, The Inkle by Alejandro... Wait, let me make sure. I think it's Alejandro Jodorowsky. Either way, I think his first name is Alejandro Jodorowsky, and Moebius, who I mentioned worked on Silver Surfer Parable alongside Stan Lee. Either way, The Inkle is a story of this just inept, just literally he's pretty freaking stupid, detective, private eye, who discovers this item that is the key to saving the universe. He then goes across the universe on this space opera epic, just doing everything he can alongside people who are much more competent than him, including this assassin hitman character named the Meta Baron, to save the galaxy. But, it just gets weird. The art is beautiful, except very freaky, and there are some mature scenes in here, so once again, kids, ask your parents before you read it. And as I mentioned earlier, this is an interesting work because of the fact that a lot of people, including Jodorowsky himself, believe that The Fifth Element, starring Bruce Willis, pretty much ripped off of this book. And that was, as I said earlier, because Moebius, the artist, had worked on the concept art for the movie, as well as drawn and, illustrated this book in its entirety. So I can see where they're coming from, but this is one of those staple pieces of just the graphic novel world because it's such a expansive, all-encompassing story, almost spanning multiverses, spanning multiple dimensions, spanning different planets. Very weird. It's this dystopian Earth. It just ties in multiple... I don't know. I'm rambling. It's a good series. If you're a fan of sci-fi, I highly recommend it. Once again, it's a space opera, so it's a space opera epic, so it's just very grand in scale. Then we get into Material, Volume 1. So this is by Alice Cott, who I believe I had mentioned is a very kind of edgy, socially driven, or social and politically driven writer. However, in Material, yes, there are elements of this, but he has these 4 intertwined stories that have nothing to do with each other that he discusses in each issue. And I think this is a collection of issues 1 through 4, which is actually all that ever came out. There was supposed to be a second series or a second volume, but I don't think it ever came to light. However, in the stories, you have these different weird takes on just, people's lives as they're going on. You have a young boy who's been taken to a Chicago black site by some cops who have a vendetta against his uncle who was formerly in the Black Panthers, and you have this art teacher this professor who works at a school who is talking to his computer because it's apparently become a sentient AI. There is just a weird number of stories in here. I mean, just weird depth to each of the stories, all four of them that are interwoven in some level, even tangentially. I said they have nothing to do with each other, but I would have to reread it just to make sure there are things I just didn't pick up on. I would recommend it for people who like anthology series, but it's definitely something that I enjoyed at the time, but would have to reread to really, I think, soak it in. Next up, we have Low by Rick Remender. Low is set in this underwater civilization in Earth. Once again, kind of this post-apocalyptic world where everybody lives underwater, but has also been fractured into sects. It's kind of like, or sections and different parts of society. So it's almost like Aquaman when you see this, these different Atlantean cultures where mankind is separated into these near barbaric cultures. It's got very fantastic art by Greg Tocchini, who, I mean, always kills it. He also worked with Rick Remender on The Last Days of American Crime, which is also getting a TV adaptation this year. But it's a fantastic sci-fi series. I've only read the first volume, but I started on the second volume and just got overwhelmed with the number of books I was reading. Can't wait to pick this series back up, but it's still in publication right now. And that's important to note because Rick Remender is working on multiple books right now, including this and Black Science, both by Image, which is this indie label that's right up there with Marvel and DC. But once again, this is a book I've checked out. I'd have to reread it to soak it back in. But Rick Remender, when he does his own stuff, is usually on fire, and this is not an exception to that. Then we have 2 out of 3 of the books of the Luther Strode series. So I believe I had touched on this earlier, just for those who like very balls to the wall, hyper violent comics. This one is about this boy Luther Strode. He's your typical mousy high schooler until he discovers a comic book with one of those one of those little clip out advertisements in the back, you know, for those Atlas Strongman programs or something like that. Well, the thing is, he commits to it and it actually works. He becomes this huge muscle-bound hulking figure that is almost impervious to whatever gets thrown at him. He can heal, he's super strong, super fast, but he's also finds out that he's almost become just brutally barbaric. He wants to tear apart anybody who opposes him, or he can see the musculature of different human beings and how to just destroy them or tear them apart. It's very brutal, especially because you find out that he's not the only one to have mastered this technique. Other people who have mastered this technique include Samson, straight out of the Bible, and Jack the Ripper. So, very weird, very awesome. I really enjoyed it. There's a 3rd volume as well, but I only bought the first 2. But I've read the series in its entirety. I got the 3rd volume actually in single issues, so it's in my collection in my closet. But I recommend this series for people who just like over-the-top action and aren't afraid of a little blood and gore. Next we have one of my favorite Batman comics, which is Batman Absolution. So this asks the story of how far does vengeance go? How far does revenge and justice go? In this story we have Batman faced against domestic terrorists who commit a bombing in Gotham 10 years ago. 10 years later in the story, we find out that Batman still very much got a vendetta against these terrorists and has tracked one of them down, their ringleader, to South America, where he tracks her down, finds her, and finds her as a nun in a monastery. So she's made peace with her past, or is rather trying to atone for her past, but Batman is very much not okay with it. So as he's trying to bring her back to Gotham, events take place that just lead to a lot of violence and destruction, as well as Batman having to confront whether or not he believes in the idea of a god, as well as the idea of mercy and grace in the wake of his quest for vengeance and justice. It's one of my favorite Batman stories because it deals with the idea that Batman is typically portrayed as an atheist, but also that he acknowledges, in some cases, the idea of a higher power, as well as that he's having to confront where he draws the line with respect to his, once again, his quest for vengeance. Yep. And 7 Against Chaos. Harlan Ellison's a pretty famous, I say pretty famous, really famous sci-fi author who is known for works such as, oh gosh, A Boy and His Dog, as well as writing multiple Star Trek episodes. So when we get into Seven Against Chaos, we have this interesting sci-fi narrative about the end of the world coming, or rather I should say, I think the end of the universe, because of this hyper-intelligent reptilian race of aliens that are coming to destroy everything. However, this band of 7 different heroes, like a robot, a man from Earth, as well as this girl who can ignite or combust at will. It's very interesting, but they have to travel across the universe to face these reptilian beings. But then, as we get towards the end of things, once we get to the final page, there's a huge twist that just makes it very interesting because the story starts to go into parallel timelines and realities and a lot of different elements leading to how these reptilian beings are actually trying to enact the end of the world. So yeah, it's pretty cool. I really enjoyed it. I was really taken aback by the fact that Ellison was writing a comic, but this actually isn't the first time he's written a comic. I believe in addition to that, he actually wrote a issue or an episode of Batman 66, which is a comic based on the 1960s Batman show. Now we have Civil War, which is one of the first comics me and my brother bought. Actually, my brother bought this and I'm holding on to it until he gets out of college. But this is a comic that Captain America 3 Civil War was based off of. Events are clearly different in this one because this is the mainline Marvel continuity, the 616 universe, where Tony Stark and Captain America get into a feud because after the events leading to the Registration Act becoming mandatory, they start to differ in their ideology, to the point that Captain America starts this underground revolution of sorts of all these heroes and even villains who want to team up to stop the Registration Act and oppose Iron Man. It's also pretty cool because of the fact that not just, like I said, not just heroes are coming forward, vigilantes and villains are also coming forward to register so that they can pretty much enter plea bargains for their crimes and act as heroes in the pursuit of all these people siding with Captain America. Now, a huge difference between this and the movie is the fact that Peter Parker still plays a huge role, but differently. Prior to the events of this comic, Spider-Man had become an Avenger. Tony Stark took him under his wing and built the Iron Spider suit for him. However, you find out that Tony Stark did this kind of selfishly in order to use Peter to help promote the Registration Act by having him as Spider-Man unmasked live on TV so that a lot more heroes and villains would come forward to register because they saw Spider-Man, this kind of legendary protector of New York, unmasked in front of them. Now, this once again deviates a lot more from the movie. It's a lot more mature, there's a lot more violence, and yeah, it leads into a lot of interesting Marvel spin-offs, including Dark Reign, including, I'm trying to think, oh, yes, both Tony Stark, then Norman Osborn becoming the directors of S.H.I.E.L.D., as well as Spider-Man being on the, oh gosh, man, I can't remember, the new Avengers team, that's right, led by Luke Cage, where they were on the run having to hide themselves from the registration and, more importantly, Norman Osborn. Now we get to Arkham Asylum, a serious house on a serious earth, also by Grant Morrison and Dave McKean. Now, this is a team that is, Dave McKean is not unfamiliar to the world of comics, mainly because he usually teams up with Neil Gaiman for a lot of work. But Dave McKean's style is just very signature. He doesn't just paint or illustrate. He also uses real-world objects in his just visualization of comic book scenery and all that. And that's no exception from Arkham Asylum. And you have Grant Morrison writing it, so it's on both ends, writing and illustration, just a very trippy comic, kind of portraying Batman's hysteria as he enters Arkham Asylum to stop revolts and from the people inside being hurt by the criminals who have been indicted there. Now, it's by Grant Morrison, so once again, it's a very trippy comic, but it's largely considered to be a quintessential Batman work, but it's not something to really start off with. Once again, this is about Batman not being in his element, because yes, there are comics where Batman enters Arkham Asylum and he very much just wrecks shop, but in this comic we see a Batman who's honestly in some parts afraid. He's just this is just a different sense of Batman. He's facing different villains who are in different mental states. You even have this Two-Face who, rather than using a coin, flipping a coin, is being taught how to make multiple decisions, to the point that you find out that he's not even eating or taking care of himself because he's having to make too many decisions, whether that's with a deck of cards or the roll of a dice. Very, very good work, very surreal, as well as just kind of, I don't know, puts you into this weird state of delusion just because of how weird the art and the writing is, as well as Batman's interaction with different villains and characters throughout the comic. But once again, once you get into Batman and are a little bit more familiar with the character, I can't recommend reading this enough. It's kind of a middle ground Batman piece once you're familiar with the character and know enough about his interactions with other villains and his relation to Arkham Asylum. Then we get into Black Panther by Ta-Nehisi Coates. I've already mentioned this one previously because I have a deluxe edition of it collecting the first 2 volumes, but first I had bought the single issue volume and I lent it to my cousin, but I just got it back. So I really like Ta-Nehisi Coates' take on Black Panther because it's a lot more political. Once again, to just summarize it, it's about a Wakanda that no longer wants a monarchy. They don't want T'Challa as king, they want a democracy. And this results in an insurgency, just domestic terrorism, as well as the people uprising and revolting against T'Challa. Then we have Black Panther by Reginald Hudlin and John Romita Jr., who is commonly known as JRJR in his signatures. So this is just an introductory, I guess a rehash of the Black Panther story of him in Wakanda having to face down his opponent Claw, who has a signature vibranium cannon, and I believe at that point is maybe made out of sound waves. Either way, if I recall correctly, this is the issue or the collection where T'Challa's mother dies, and it leads into just another arc and a kind of vengeance quest against T'Challa hunting down Claw and those who had invaded Wakanda as well as killed his mother. Then we go into Doctor Strange the Oath. Now, this story is regarding Doctor Strange having to save his servant Wong, who several of y'all will know from the movie as Benedict Wong, who is Doctor Strange's actually his teacher. But in the comics traditionally, Wong is his servant and right-hand man. However, when he starts to pass away, Doctor Strange goes on a hunt to find the Panacea, which is this alchemic potion that can cure any disease. However, there are forces at play who would rather steal it and mass-produce it and sell it for a premium. But that's the Hippocratic Oath that Doctor Strange talks about. This book in particular is about his role as a doctor and the fact that he's not about just mass-producing it and in the long run saving the most people, which is unfortunate because that would be great, but the fact that he already made a pledge to save Wong and knows what he needs to do in the immediate to save at least one life. Then we go into Dark Knight, gosh, these reflections are killing me. And then we go into Dark Knight, a true Batman story. So this is written by Paul Dini, who is one of the predominant Batman writers who worked on Batman the Animated Series. Now with Dark Knight, with Dark Knight, a Batman story, a true Batman story, you have this interesting narrative and tale, not about Batman, but about the writer, about Paul Dini. He goes over the events of this mugging that happens to him. He's beaten, he's bruised, and he's robbed by these two, just I guess, hoodlums or whatever, these robbers, and then his just recovery mentally and physically from that, as well as kind of withdrawal from people and how this plays into him having worked on Batman, the kind of revenge and justice he seeks, but more so the insecurities he faces as a human being, especially as a result of his mugging. It plays into a lot of just more psychological elements as well as what heroes and these characters actually mean to us in our lives. Because it not just regards Batman as well as this picture of vigilante justice and the like, but also his interaction with villains as well. These different imaginary encounters and conversations he's having just regarding his psychological state as well as, once again, those insecurities he's facing, not just with regards to his mugging, but with regards to relationships and working and the like. And finally, we have American-Born Chinese by Jean Lun Young, who And finally, we have American-Born Chinese by Jean Lun Young, who some of you may know from having written the last several arcs of the New 52 Superman, as well as writing All New Superman as part of DC's Rebirth event. This was a Chinese Superman who was becoming a member of the Chinese attempt at the Justice League. Now we have in American-Born Chinese a somewhat biographically inspired tale of a Asian American boy growing up in America and just trying his best to fit in. Now this relates, I'm assuming, to Jean Lun Young's experience as an Asian American, just trying to grow up, fit in, and realizing just how different he is from his fellow classmates, from his friends, from people he tries to make acquaintances with, as well as just how much this ties into our culture and just our kind of human nature to want to just side or be attracted to those who look maybe the most similar to us. Once again, it does go into race relations, but not necessarily on too much a political level, but just on a personal level about what we do to try and fit in, as well as where we gain our sense of identity from as a human being. It was very touching work. I really liked it, especially kind of growing up with a weird sense of identity myself, so I really appreciated this work and thought it was very tastefully done without projecting too much of the creator's own political or just kind of personal views, but more so just telling a very earnest story about being a kid in America. And that's it. That's it. Oh my gosh, yes. That's it. That's all of the comics in my collection. Holy crap. I don't even know how many we counted. I'll tally that up and add it to the details. But thank you all so much for joining me on this incredible journey, because it took 6 parts and roughly 5 or 6 hours apparently to deliver this. So guys, thanks for sticking with it. If you got any comments, feedback, suggestions, or would like to know more about some of the comics I mentioned, or any suggestions, etc., please comment down below. I'd love to hear what you have to say, and also hit me up on Instagram or Facebook or on social media. I'd love to talk with you, or if you just want to chat about movie trailers, comics, TV shows, I'm game for that too. And if you liked what you saw, please hit the like button. I'd love the support. If you really liked what you saw, please hit the subscribe button. That would be very much appreciated. And as always, if you really, really, really like what you saw, tell Marvel to cast me as Blade in 2020. I mean it. But that being said, y'all, thanks so much for joining me for another episode of King's Comics, and I will see you next time.